Okay, welcome to the Estyn podcast on improving attendance. We're exploring our thematic report that we've recently republished and updated around improving attendance in secondary schools. I'm Alan Edwards, HMI with Estyn, and I'd like to introduce my two guests. So Ian, if you could start.
My name's Ian Lloyd. I am the head teacher at St Tylo's Church and Wells High School in Cardiff.
And I'm Paul Warren. I'm the lead for school improvement for Caerphilly Local Authority.
Great, thanks both, and thanks for joining me. Looking forward to talking about this topic. So we've recently republished our thematic on this, and what we did is we went back to the schools that we spotlighted in the last report and kind of looked at where they were now. Ian, you were one of those schools, and we also went to a few other schools where they'd seen some recent improvements in attendance, and we'll explore some of the findings from that. But I guess what I'd like to start with really is talking about the challenges that we face around improving attendance. And in the thematic, we did identify quite a few challenges schools face, some of those being school transport, where pupils are not entitled to free transport if they live beyond within the 3-mile radius. And that presents a challenge, as did a new challenge that came through this year, was particularly trying to maintain Year 11's attendance right up to the end of term once exams have started. Secondaries talk quite a lot about struggling with that. But I guess what are the kind of biggest challenges you're seeing, Ian, that you're facing in your school?
So I think I want to begin by saying that attendance issues, like so many things, are people issues. Yeah. And people issues are inherently very messy, complicated, and infinitely varied. So we have to be cautious when we have discourse around the challenges of attendance, not to be negative and not to enter into the blame game. Yeah. As early as 2008, Ken Reid in the National Behaviour and Attendance Review would talk about blame. Families blame schools for issues of absenteeism, poor teaching, curriculum, lack of support. Schools blame families, lack of aspiration, lack of routine, lack of boundary. And young people blame no one, because for them being out of school is the solution, not the problem at all. So in today's reality, and in particular since the COVID pandemic, I think we have to understand the rise in poor attendance in relationship with other issues. So I've written a few down. Increased emotional dysregulation and distress in young people. Waiting times and referrals which are rejected for young people's mental health services. A collapse in the system for neurodevelopmental assessment, rising rates of childhood poverty, for parents, increased feelings of isolation and decision fatigue, and a decline in public trust in public services, including education services and schools. And all of this is happening against a backdrop of squeezed budgets and of a particularly challenging workforce recruitment, retention and well-being issue. The point I'm making, I think, is that it's a perfect storm at the moment, and it's complex. But it's also really high stakes. I'm always drawn back to some of the Dullan William work around good school attendance, where we know that great school attendance is likely to lead to a longer life expectancy, reduced disability and increased health. You're less likely to be in the criminal justice system, less likely to become a teenage parent, less likely to commit suicide, more likely to be tolerant of others and lead a happy life. So it's pretty high stakes stuff that we're trying to address. But I think what I would say is my learning has been that because it is messy, because it is complex, before you get into the weeds of the strategy, you have to address culture. Yeah. You have to give a high regard to the culture of your school. You have to ensure that your school is a place of safety, first and foremost, a place of formation, a place of affirmation, of dignity, of community, ambition. I might even be bold and say that schools should be places of love.
That you need them to want to be there, don't you? That's essentially, they need to feel part of, want to be there.
Particularly during adolescence. Young people will vote with their feet. And there's very little that parents can do when a child refuses to attend. In my own setting, we talk about spaces. So we say that every space a young person encounters should be a learning space, a healing space, and a sacred space. And the idea of that is that those spaces are attuned to people's emotions and the role that emotions play in unlocking learning. So I think my position is that we won't resolve the attendance crisis unless children want to be in school. And that's a culture thing.
Yeah. And I guess that it's a culture thing both ways, isn't it? Because it's about, one, bringing them in and then helping them realise the importance of when they're there. And I think that's something that schools talked a lot about that perception of the importance of attending regularly and kind of feeling more like it wasn't prior to the pandemic. We didn't quite have that same sense that it wasn't as important. But I think that's all part of culture, isn't it? It's about them feeling wanted there, but also once they're there, engaging, enjoying, and so on.
And I think there was a social contract that no longer exists. We asked children to stay at home for 2 years, and perhaps some of the traditions that we once enjoyed have now been compromised.
And Paul, obviously you're overseeing this in a range of schools in your role as local authority lead. Are you seeing similar challenges in your schools?
Yes, absolutely. Schools report, secondary schools report, there are huge levels of anxiety everywhere. So we talk, as you said, about children, mental health issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, low mood, anxieties from parents. Their children might be struggling. It's very difficult to send your child off to school every morning, knowing that they may struggle. So you've got this world of anxieties, and it's about having to reshape your school to meet the need of this post-COVID world. I think, the feedback I get from head teachers, they tried to go back to how life was, but it didn't work. So they're having to be increasingly inventive and innovative in ways that, whether it's curriculum, whether it's their pastoral support, in terms of what they're going to do to kind of meet the needs of these learners. Against that, as you touched on, is around constraints around budgets. We know that schools are faced with constraints over financial management and there is a willingness to do something different, but sometimes you are constrained by what the budget allows. So it's about schools having to be increasingly creative in terms of how they use their resources, how they plan their provision in schools, really focus. But this sense of going back to what life used to be is really, we tried it and it didn't work and we're having to do something different. The other thing, just to touch upon, which hasn't been mentioned, is around that transition from primary to secondary. So we are seeing, the challenges around attendance in secondary school are being mirrored at primary level as well. And if you have children who are very reluctant to attend school, that's going to continue as they go into this big world of secondary school. And we also see alongside that, there's issues around, through these gaps that children have had in their learning, they may not have the literacy skills that they would have had a few years ago. So therefore, they're at a disadvantage around the expectations about reading and other kind of literacy skills.
Yeah. And it becomes a bit of a cycle, doesn't it? Because if they're not there, you can't improve those skills, but then they become increasingly nervous to engage in school because they're worried about exposing those.
So I guess, in the past, we've talked about the importance of clusters working together through primaries, secondaries collaborating. That is more important now. And again, clusters have to be increasingly creative in terms of how they plan for these pupils, this transition. So again, to give them that kind of pathway as smooth as possible so they feel ready for learning when they enter year 7.
Do you see in your authority any of those schools working together? Because particularly if you've got similar families or the same family, actually both schools in a way could be trying to support that family separately. Rather than if you work as a kind of joint together, you can actually probably avoid that duplication of resource and so on. Yeah, are you seeing any do that?
Yeah, we've seen some really good examples of cluster plans. Okay. Which focused on attendance, and it's making sure the right people in the room together to talk about kind of the transition of these pupils. The issue around attendance is so all-consuming for us at the moment. We've got to make sure it permeates every conversation. So you might be having a cluster conversation as pastoral leads, family liaison officers, literacy coordinators. It could be anything, but we've got to make sure attendance feeds into that, and to make sure that pathway, that continuity of learning, really supports those pupils that would be at risk of not attending when they come in at year 7.
Okay. And how, Ian, you talked a bit about how you're overcoming some of these challenges, particularly around this culture. What change has that led to in your school? How have you seen it develop and support some of these challenges?
So I'd start by saying we do all of the normal stuff. Like every other school, we send letters and we have homeschool agreements, and we send nudge texts on a Friday afternoon, and we report attendance to parents, and in all of the ways that you would expect a secondary school to do so. But that starting point being a point of culture before strategy has challenged us to have a shift in mindset, to view poor school attendance through a different lens. So in my setting, we will talk more about what children need and less about what they deserve. Poor school attendance is a problem that we have to work together to solve. It's not a behaviour that we need to punish or admonish.
So I guess changing the mindset of staff too in the way that they look at it.
That's key. So we now would consider poor school attendance to be a learning need, like any other learning need. Our particular mechanism for dealing with this is something we call the learning support pathway. And our learning support pathways exist at 2 non-statutory levels, universal support and targeted support, and then at a statutory level of additional learning provision under the auspices of the Additional Learning Needs and Education Tribunal Act. And that pathway is really quite straightforward. It starts with an assessment of need. And the assessment of need starts with the voice of the child. And that's very, very key to the assessment being accurate. And we've had to be very intentional about not just listening to the child, but really hearing what they're saying or not saying, as the case may be. Once we've captured the view of children, we'll next look to the thoughts, opinions, suggestions of parents and carers. So that's the next stakeholder view that's given the most priority.
How sorry to Tim, but how easy is it to engage those parents in that process? Because you talked earlier about that kind of social contract.
It can be challenging.
Okay.
We will talk about the way in,
right.
And we describe the way in as being in person, intentional and informal.
Okay.
And that's kind of a way, it, for example, might mean be meeting in a safe space, like their home, as opposed to your school. Once we've completed that assessment, we've got the views of teachers and of the school. Perhaps we've looked at some standardised scores to get a picture of where this young person's at. We enter a very simple cycle of plan, do, review. And the sorts of interventions we offer are reasonably standard, but we're making sure they're tailored very much to the need of that individual person. No whole school strategy, a person-centred and strength-based strategy for each individual child. So it could be very simple and very cheap. It could be ensuring there's an emotionally available adult at break times for that young person to chat to. It could be a morning check-in to set the day up right. It could be a positive tracker so that the day is spent gathering great feedback from teachers that the child can take home and they can feel success while they're in the school. It might be more structural. It might involve modification of the curriculum or withdrawal from certain lessons and redirection into other provision. It could be emotional health and wellbeing intervention, Thrive and those sorts of things. We have therapeutic interventions, counselling, play therapy, art therapy, creative therapy, psychotherapy that we've managed to weave in to the life of the school, or it could be in-class support or small group support. So those are the sorts of interventions that we would use in the same way that you'd use them for any other learning need. And in the most chronic of cases, we would repeat that assessment of need in a much more thorough way, and that would move us into the auspices of the 35-day process to consider additional learning needs. And if the particular barriers and challenges that the young person is facing would amount to having significantly greater difficulty in learning than their peers. So really the approach is about not having an approach. The approach is about being person-centred and strengths-based. It's done with, not to or for children and their families. What I will say for us in terms of our next steps is that's very effective at dealing with absence chronically.
Yes.
Those marginal gains, 90 to 95%, that's where we've still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Okay. And that leads actually, because you mentioned a bit about curriculum and so on. And one of the things we found particularly when we were looking at this through this thematic is, in some of the strongest cases, what schools do is they do those person-centred things. They focus on the individual. Sometimes, and as you said, you do those whole school things too around promoting and so on. But they think about their curriculum and they think about teaching, because the important thing is, isn't it? Of course, you can do lots to get pupils back in, but if they come in and they're having poor learning experiences across the school, they're not likely to maintain that attendance. So are you alongside this? Are you doing work to consider your curriculum, improve the quality of teaching so that they are getting these high quality experiences?
That is, in my view, essential to improving attendance. There's little we can do about all those societal issues I espoused at the beginning. My school can't fix child poverty in Wales, but we can give children reasons to come, and great teaching and learning, feeling of success and of progress and of beating your personal best, mitigating the fear of failure, feeling that the curriculum speaks to your particular needs and interests and lived experiences and values. These are the type of levers that we do have control over that give people meaningful educational experiences.
Yeah, thanks. And Paul, obviously, in the local authority, you play a crucial role in supporting and challenging schools on this, and it is a challenging area. It's something that we are seeing. It's hard to improve. On the positive, unverified data suggests that we are seeing some improvement. I think we've seen a kind of percentage point increase, which in attendance, actually, that's quite hard to come by. And we are seeing more and more schools improve their attendance. But how are you supporting and challenging your schools to address this?
Okay, so the first thing to say is that, we've just had a really good example of a school really thinking outside the box in terms of what it can do to really kind of improve its approach. And my experience is I've yet to meet a head teacher or a school that is not fully committed to addressing the issue. I think our role within the local authority is just to give that kind of guidance and advice around what are they doing? Is it maximising the impact in terms of the use of the resources? And how can we give a kind of a fresh perspective? There's a couple of things, we talk about schools having to look at itself, readdress its priorities, change its approach. We've had to do the same in the local authority. I mean, self-evaluation is essential in schools. It's essential as us within the local authority as well. So there's a few things we've done since COVID that have had a significant impact. The first is about the self-evaluation journey for schools. So early on, a few years ago, after COVID, we identified there was a sense that things will return back to normal. They didn't. We sensed we had to do something different. So we employed a pastoral lead from a secondary school who was very experienced in working with young children. He worked in the most disadvantaged area within the local authority, so understood about some of the challenges that were faced. And he has gone around each of the schools and has worked with looking at their roles and responsibilities across the school, looking at the processes in place, looking in terms of that kind of holistic approach to attendance. That includes conversations with pupils, conversation with governors, and that is looking at the data, of course. And that has produced, every school has had a dialogue, a discussion, a shared evaluation activity that has resulted in a report with recommendations that can then be shared with the governing body. Every school has signed up for that because you've got the willingness to take part. And that's been really helpful because it's a sense that we are working in partnership with the schools. We are not looking to tell schools they're not doing good enough, because they are trying exceptionally hard at the moment to improve attendance. But that self-evaluation that activity has really helped schools have a fresh perspective, because you might have had a person really focused on an aspect of attendance, but you might have had another person down the corridor doing exactly the same job. So it's about making sure that there's that kind of realignment of approach. So we've looked at that. I think probably that's been the most effective activity we've done. I think we've always got to look at the role of education welfare officers. Yeah. They are hugely skilled in the work they do with families. They've got bags of empathy. They know when to challenge when it's appropriate, and they work well with schools, children, us, officers in the local authority, and they really kind of support as best they can. I'd say the other thing that we've done, which has had a huge impact, is about how we've utilised data that we've collected. So on a monthly basis, we share the attendance data for all schools across everyone, and all schools have signed up to that. And they really welcome it, because every month you get data on your school, and it compares to your attendance this time last year, because we know there are seasonal trends around attendance. It provides data on EFSM pupils, because we think that is the key indicator now moving forward if a school is doing well. We also share data around ALN, around gender, and then we also share data around persistent absenteeism. We share the old 80% marker, because we can see comparison over time, but we also share the 90% one as well. Schools find that really useful, because they can see in terms of how the trends are going across all schools in Caerphilly, where I work. They also can see where there's a school with a similar profile which might be breaking through in attendance. So it encourages them to go and see that school to see what they're doing. And we've had some really good examples of that. The third thing I would suggest that we've done around support and challenge is around the training that we offer. So prior to COVID, it was a one-size-fits-all bit of training. And it didn't, we look back, we think it could have been better. So you could have been a head teacher, you could have been a family liaison officer, you could have been a clerk, you could have been a business manager, you might have been in that training. We've now separated the training out to make sure that it is absolutely meeting the needs. So a business manager, a family liaison officer, a clerk in a school might get some training on having a difficult conversation with a parent, because that's the bit that people find difficult sometimes. I meet with the head teachers, and we actually looked at the secondary report from Estyn on attendance and went through that. We've talked about things such as reduced timetables, making sure that they are working in a purposeful way that reintegrate. So, I'm really proud of the people, everyone in Caerphilly, because they have all galvanised, they've reflected on the work they've done, and we have had to adapt our provision and our support.
Yes, thank you. It's interesting as well what you say about the use of data, because actually that was one of the things we found in this report, where in the most effective cases, schools were using data really considerately and really thinking carefully about what it was telling them. Where it was less effective, generally schools weren't analysing that data effectively enough. They had it, they weren't using it. But it's, I think, importantly what you said about the comparisons to points in the year, because we are seeing still a number of schools across Wales, they're comparing the point at which they are now to where they were at the end of the year. And that doesn't always help you, because it can mask that you think you're improving. And I think that leads me, now having spoken to you as part of this thematic, you're quite careful the way you use data, particularly at different points in the year. So you set different boundaries, don't you, for interventions on. Can you just kind of explain that
of course.
A little bit?
For this particular issue, we talk about stories and statistics.
Yeah.
You've heard a little bit about the stories, the capturing of voices, and the constant renewal and review of what it is that you're trying to do. How do we know if this is effective? Yeah. There's no quick way of knowing that other than getting into the detail and talking to children and their families, and looking at their individual case at a whole school level. We don't place a great deal of value on absolute percentages, because you miss a day in the first week, you're on 80% attendance. 80% attendance doesn't mean anything because it is the point in the year that matters most. So we set out a very basic model of green, yellow, amber and red, unsurprisingly, and we fill spreadsheets, and the boundaries for each of those categories changes over time. So the percentages increase during the year. We also ratify that data, which is a burdensome task. There's no shortcut to it. But for example, my particular context has a very high level of ethnic minority children who oftentimes will travel during the summer holiday to other parts of the world and may miss the first 3 weeks of September, but otherwise have perfect attendance. In absolute terms, they come up on your list with a red flag, but we're not really worried about their attendance. It's a different issue that we need to address with that family. So as we rank all of those children, we then open each of their attendance registers across all 1,500 young people and interrogate on an individual basis that data and change where we think that learner should be, so that the very limited resource that we have is being focused where it's going to have the maximum effect.
Yeah. And that's the point, isn't it? Because otherwise you could end up putting a lot of resource into a pupil that actually will attend well after missing a small period or something. It's
precisely a young person who's broken their leg and missed 5 weeks of school is not a cause for concern in terms of their attendance. Yeah. But you have to know that to be able to respond effectively.
We've had some really good outcomes from really working with schools, secondary schools, where they might have been a bit stuck with their attendance, because it comes back. Everyone's working very well. They're working very hard to address it, but it wasn't breaking through. When we use the data to scrutinise things like year groups, groups of pupils, that really helped the school target and intervene where it needed to. And we've seen some examples of secondary schools in the last 12 months have increased by about 3%. Now, I'd love all schools to increase by 3% in a year, but it just goes to show that actually when you use the data in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way, it can lead to better provision, more targeted support, and then it can impact on that overall figure.
Yeah, and I think that's important because Ian, you mentioned stories and so on, and actually data tells you a level of a story, doesn't it? And any data is only really there to raise questions, but actually with attendance it is different because it does give you a bit of an insight to start asking the questions about why the attendance is where it is, what can we do? And when you start to look at groups, it allows you to think about how you might tackle different groups and what things work. But as I said, it's interesting because we are seeing this improve. But there are, and we said this in the thematic, and we see it through core inspections, there are still some schools that don't always look at this quite as precisely as they could. And I think using that data is really important in setting that next part. Of course, then what happens, though, is as you do that and you've seen some of these 3 percentage point increases and so on, it gets harder because the more you improve attendance, the more you're starting to work with your harder to reach, aren't you? Because you're getting, which, can be more challenging.
You're absolutely right. So when we started our journey of self-evaluation with schools, it was very much about who's doing what in the school, what are the processes, how efficient, and then we get to a point where we're satisfied all secondary schools have got really robust processes in place. That's when it comes back to your point around those much trickier issues that lead to persistent absenteeism. And then that's a whole other story that we've really got to look at a more holistic approach. Yeah. And then it comes back to your initial point about curriculum and teaching.
Yeah. And you've got to have all those things, haven't you, to allow it to work. And the other thing, because you've talked about evaluation, but one of the key things about improving anything in a school is that strategic approach and really knowing what's working, what isn't working, how are we going to continue to drive this improvement. So we have to evaluate the impact things are having. Attendance, there's a level of it that's quite straightforward to evaluate because you've got data, but you also do a lot. So knowing which has led to the improvement makes it quite challenging too. So it's kind of, on one side, it seems like it's quite easy to evaluate. On others, so how do you set about, Ian, evaluating, particularly because for you're working with an individual in this person-centred approach, but equally you'll want to know how it's working across the school. So how are you evaluating it?
So For us, we're doing it both at the micro and the macro, in that each of those learning interventions, that targeted support in and of itself, is evaluated.
Yeah.
The member of staff delivering it evaluates it. The young person and family provide feedback on what's worked and what could have been better for them. So at that level, there is an analysis of what is working for young people. Because we are categorizing and ratifying data, what we can also then see is the residuals when children move from one category to another. So we're able to ascertain if there is a general trend in the right direction. We're obviously comparing ourselves to ourselves at the same point in the last few years. And that gives us confidence about whether or not things are moving in the right direction. Our next step, and what we're now seeing in its infancy in other schools, is the use of AI to analyse attendance data. Now, I can't speak to the efficacy of this because I've not yet done it, but other head teachers are. And where this has become helpful is that you can offer up an individual, and the AI will produce a narrative about noticing that Fridays are a particular problem, but also you can put groups of learners and groups of children into the artificial intelligence to get back some of the more nuanced aspects of the information that you otherwise might miss.
Yeah. And I suppose that would potentially give you an opportunity to save some resource in one place that could be shifted to driving the improvement rather than spending the time unpicking the data and so on.
And it's just helpful in terms of making sensible logistical decisions.
Yeah.
Again, in my school, when it comes to particular religious festivals, we know there will be a decline in attendance. So what can we do at those points in the year to encourage better attendance?
Yeah. And I think that evaluation part is really important, particularly both of you have talked about the restrictions around how challenging it is around finance and so on. So there gets a point where things have to stop. So you really need to know what is working and what's not, because you don't want to stop doing things that are or keep putting resource into something that isn't. And for you, Paul, it's interesting because you're having to support schools to evaluate, but equally you need to evaluate whether the local authority's provision is supporting schools to improve. So how do you set about supporting your schools, but importantly, drawing that information up to your level to then say, how is our approach supporting all schools?
So the first one's easy. I ask the heads how I'm doing. So that's it is because it's built on relationships, isn't it? And we're very open in terms of when we have our head teacher meetings, we talk about a shared journey. We talk about the provision that we're offering, the support, and they will tell us if that is worked or not quite early on, and we amend as appropriate. So stakeholder feedback is essential, and it's okay to hear that sometimes you may not have got it right because you just want the attendance to improve. So you amend the provision on the support, as you would. Data from a local authority perspective, we look at the data every month. We go through the school data, and I always do that with the education welfare officers. And then if there is a dip, they tell me that, there might be a story behind that, but then that kind of identifies in terms of, well, what's working? Why hasn't that data shifted in that school over a particular time? What do we have to do differently? And where I've talked about our strategy has been quite successful in terms of doing that self-evaluation process. You've always got to continue to consider, just because we've done it for the last 2 years, do we continue doing it? And we are going to change the model moving forward. Every school had a report with a set of recommendations. Moving forward from next year, the education welfare officer will meet and look at those recommendations alongside the school. But for those schools that still need that additional support, I mentioned we've got 2 schools in Caerphilly that have had 3% rises over the last year. Well, why don't we do some kind of peer, almost school improvement partner work where that head teacher can work alongside that school where maybe they're still a bit stuck, and then really kind of move forward that way. So we're always reinventing what we do. Just because we've been successful up to this point, we've got to continue that kind of trajectory, and therefore we need to amend accordingly.
Yeah. And I think that's quite important about this, people working together. And I think what we saw as well in some of the strongest cases when we were looking at this was that actually what schools do well when they're succeeding with this is attendance becomes everyone's responsibility. And yes, the head teacher has to see it as a strategic approach, but equally everyone throughout the school needs to understand that they have a role to play. So how have you worked with staff, Ian, in your school and then Paul across to really make sure that everyone realises that improving attendance is everyone's responsibility?
I'm not sure we've exercised any particular innovation here. We simply talk about it a lot. And we have a big emphasis, as you can imagine, as a church school, on belonging. And actually in Curriculum for Wales, we might call it Cynefin, and that sense of providing spaces that young people feel connected to. So I don't think there's anything more that we've done other than to keep it on the radar. Yeah. Now we have stakeholders at different levels throughout the school. So the senior leadership team and governors review attendance. We meet with our middle leaders and review attendance. We have pastoral leads who manage attendance. And then we have a team of form tutors who are engaged in conversations with children about attendance alongside our non-teaching staff who have very particular and focused roles here. So as a result of that, everyone is feeding into the same system.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
And exactly the same at local authority level. It has got to be everyone's business. We have a corporate plan, which is a bit like a school development plan. Our number one priority is improving attendance. And then from that, different departments have action plans that really link to what they're going to do to promote attendance and to kind of contribute to that priority. So, for example, you might have somebody with responsibility for looked after pupils. So they would make sure that attendance bit would be a key indicator for success that they would have. You might have a team, like a healthy schools team that might be focused on promoting vaccinations in a certain area to make sure children aren't getting cold so that they're able to get into school. So everybody feels they've got a part to play. That extends to scrutiny, cabinet, where we get challenged around what we're doing to promote pupil attendance. So there is that real strong buy-in from everybody to get that everyone takes ownership. I think the other thing as well is making sure that schools are maximising the support that's out there. So once a month, the different officers across the local authority meet. We always talk about attendance, but we might look at a certain group of schools that could be accessing further support from the education psychology team. And it might be they may not know what's available from the local authority to support. So we make sure that the education psychology team make links with the schools, work with a particular group of pupils in order to accelerate their attendance that way. But there is a sense, that long gone are the days it would be down to that single education welfare officer. We'd go knocking on a few doors and we'd get everyone in. It's got to be a much more coordinated response.
Definitely. And it's interesting as well because one of the key strengths we found in schools that were improving this well was where leaders set a really high expectation of attendance. And whilst they'll celebrate successes, they also recognise some of the challenge we face. And it's interesting because we left a number of recommendations in this report, some of which were for Welsh Government. One of those was around the national data that's released and trying to strengthen some of that. We have now seen primary and secondary being separated in that, which is helpful because it allows you to compare to national the national picture to know if you're improving at the same rate. But I think importantly, and I remember having this conversation with you, Ian, as part of this thematic, that actually the national figure for attendance is still not good enough. We want it to be better. And I know, Ian, you're quite keen to stress to your governing body, to your school, that to maintain this high expectation, yes, we might be above modelled outcomes, we might be performing well relatively, but that's not good enough. Can you just kind of talk a bit about how you approach that?
Yeah, I think my school is currently at 89.9% attendance, which contextually is very, very good. If you translate that percentage to learning loss, it's shocking. So I don't think we should be proud of being the least worst performer. We have to be more ambitious on this issue. There is no reason, in my view, why we shouldn't achieve pre-COVID levels. There is no reason, in my view, why schools can't continue to improve to be better than pre-COVID levels. Actually, my memory of 2019 was that attendance wasn't all that. So I think you do need to be strong on this issue of leadership, and I think you have to be highly ambitious. You used a phrase, Alan, hard to reach, and I actually think for me that phrase has become slightly problematic. We will now talk about families being underserved as opposed to hard to reach. And again, it speaks into that idea that we have some agency here. Mm-hmm. There are things that we can do both strategically and practically to help bring about positive change in this regard. And if we can do it, then we should.
Yeah. And Paul, you mentioned about your schools using data to see how well they were doing compared to similar. Are you seeing them also look at some of this national data to make those comparisons?
Caerphilly's a large authority, so there's 86 schools, so that we're able to compare. So we don't look more widely. We would bring in national themes and trends that come through, and actually our issues that we face in Caerphilly are mirrored on a wider scale. So the Estyn report was really helpful to kind of see that. I mean, just coming back to the point about, move that sense of there's a journey, there's a level of ambition. It's a balance, because we've got to celebrate the huge work that schools are doing and the hard work going on. But there's a sense of there is more to be done, and we don't want to kind of continue that in a punitive way. It's about continuing to provide schools, empower schools to give the right support in place, to give them autonomy to make the changes that they need to. It's a difficult journey, and I've just got huge admiration for schools, for everyone working in a school, because they are working as best. But sometimes schools need extra support than others. Yeah,
and sometimes it's about changing the focus of something, isn't it? Just to sharpen how you're driving that improvement, which can help.
You're right. And, our discussions that we've had with secondary schools recently has shifted. So we are talking more about curriculum now. We are seeing schools moving towards offering a more vocational offer. So providing opportunities for children to take, whether it's construction or mechanics or hair and beauty courses, because that curriculum is more meaningful for a group of pupils and it gets them into school. The other thing we've got to remember as well is about how we're providing enrichment opportunities for pupils that go outside just the typical lessons. Yeah. I can think of some really good examples where children, we've utilised grant funding in what I think is quite a creative way to provide better access to music lessons. That gives the children a reason to come in, because they access a one-to-one tuition through music, and we've identified that improves their attendance through the week when they're not having the lessons.
And it comes back to that belonging thing, doesn't it? It's about giving them things that they enjoy, about being in school. They want to be there. They want to engage. And that's helpful, isn't it? And that's where this individual approach is important in attendance, because for all pupils that might not work, but for some it will, and you've got to know what's going to work for different
The strategic bit is the self-evaluation, isn't it? What are your processes in place? What and when are you going to evaluate through the year to see if your attendance strategies are working? But under there is a layer of individuals, case by case. Are they making the progress that they need to make?
Yeah. And I agree with what you said earlier about it being important to celebrate. And I think that, but what we did see, as you say, it's recognising there's more to do, which you said too, Ian. And in the best cases, we did see leaders, yes, they would say, we recognise the progress we've made, but then they were coming back to, but there's still more to do. We have to improve attendance for all. And we've had to do similar, I think. So we've increased our expectations around attendance. We're seeing an increasing number of schools have recommendations for improving attendance. But I think it's really important. I mean, Ian, you mentioned earlier about breaking that cycle and so on around children living in poverty and so on. Well, actually, this is one of our key ways of helping to break that cycle. If we can have them in school and get all pupils into school as much as possible, we can educate them, help them get what they need to move to their next steps to try and... this is kind of one of those really important underpinning aspects of school improvement, isn't it? Without pupils there, you can't teach them, you can't develop them and so on.
And I think there's more to be done on that, isn't there? Yeah. I know certainly from, schools have really worked hard to create a sense of equity in school, around access to trips, to make sure that they're not at a disadvantage. There's probably more to be done around within the class, individuals working with the groups of learners to make sure that there is that sense of kind of equity.
And then that's that high quality teaching, high quality learning, and a curriculum that is fit for purpose for each pupil. And I think that comes back to this strategic thing, though. It's about evaluation, because as well as evaluating your attendance strategies, you have to evaluate the quality of teaching and learning for those groups of learners, particularly that are not attending as well. What is it? Are there certain days because certain things happen and so on? So you can start to unpick that. We touched a bit on persistent absence earlier. This is increasingly challenging, particularly, and you mentioned, Paul, about the 80%, the 90%. So obviously, as we've moved to the 90% measure to, again, increase expectations nationally, obviously that will increase the number of pupils that you're working with. But if we start with you, Ian, how are you starting to work to address those pupils who are persistently absent? Because it does place a greater challenge on you than those that might just have more sporadic attendance, for example.
Yes, it's hugely difficult. And habits for young people and families can become deeply entrenched. And they can be very, very difficult to change. You'll often hear, won't you, in schools when we talk about trauma and about people's experience of schools, things like connection before correction, that the relationship has to be intact before you can bring about a positive change. We've begun to use the phrase protected and connected to bring in that aspect of also offering a safe space where a relationship exists. So we've come to the view that we can't deal with the more chronic issue of persistent absenteeism if we're not mitigating shame, embarrassment, and those things that are an affront to a family's dignity. So, for example, I would include in that, and it's a personal opinion, things like legal letters and legal threats as being something that would probably be at odds with the levers that help us to improve persistent absence. So our learning has been about flexible models of education, largely. The gap now between what we offer as standard and where this young person at, that gap has become too big. Okay. And there's nothing that we can do to bridge that gap. But if we can be more flexible, then perhaps there's a route back. So we've designed some nurture bases. We have one for younger children and one for older children that offer a very bespoke curriculum. And that allows young people to be in part in the mainstream and to be in part out of it, meaning that their day is slightly easier to cope with. Perhaps we can adjust some hours if that's needed for a short period of time. We've also built a complete alternative provision base. So we no longer have to rely on sending children out into hugely expensive alternative provisions that produce very little in terms of outcomes. We can offer that all within the four walls of the school. We call that Provision T Tylo, but it's focused not only on securing outcomes for young people, but very much on enrichment and experience. Lots of trips, lots of activities that are all grounded in rebuilding confidence and helping you to get on with other young people and creating that sense of fellowship and belonging. What I would say about that is that there is a perverse equity issue in that children who are attending are seeing other young people get things that they don't get, and it doesn't feel fair. So we've actually had to introduce equity as one of our whole school strategic intentions so that young people are being educated on what equity is and why it's important and how we all benefit from helping to level the playing field. The other final thought on the issue of persistent absenteeism from me would be you have to expect it to fail and keep going and keep trying And in terms of the motivation of your workforce, that can be a challenge. But we say we have to approach these issues with the grace of God, but the persistence of the devil. You can't give up on these kids.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that links to what you said, Paul, about this is also an area where you have to celebrate those gains, particularly with those young people, because any gain for those young people that are really struggling to engage in school is a huge gain, isn't it, for them? Okay.
Similar from a local authority perspective, we've seen some really good examples of alternative tuition models being developed across schools in Caerphilly. It's something that was relatively new within the last 12 months, but we've seen some excellent practice. We are seeing children being reintegrated more into mainstream as a result of the provision put in place. Our role now is we are creating networks of best practice for them to see. Just picking up one on something, you talk about the legalities and the warnings and the penalties. I mean, from an LA point of view, we would always support governing bodies who want to implement the fixed penalty notice process, because sometimes, when you have tried everything, there might be a time that you have to use that as a tool within your strategies you've got. And we have seen some success as a result as well.
But that comes back to what we talked earlier about strategic evaluation, knowing when it'll work, knowing when it won't. There are times you might send it and it might break a relationship. It wouldn't be the sensible thing to do.
Yeah.
Other times.
It's knowing the pupils and the families really well about what is what
Definitely,
and when.
Definitely. Thank you both. I've enjoyed discussing this with you. Hopefully, if you've enjoyed this, please feel free to read our thematic report, which you can find online on our website under improvement resources. And we hope you enjoyed listening. We'll revisit this as we revisit the thematic at future dates. And if you did find this podcast helpful, please like and subscribe to our page so you can see the others. Thank you. Thanks both. Thanks Ian. Thanks Paul. I've enjoyed. Diolch.